Dennis, I'm going to start off with you. I mean, the program, of course, takes effect this month, starting today. Part of the aim to help improve the country's long-term manufacturing capacity, help lower the current account deficit, and overall improve the economy. I mean, what's your overall view on the step that we're taking here?
Well, look, I think the goals are absolutely admirable, and I don't think anyone could really complain about those. What concerns me overall about the approach being taken, though, is it's very much more of an interventionist sort of approach that government is envisaging. So there's very much the sort of feeling that the state knows best, the state will direct the resources, and there are a number of problems around that, clearly, because, but no doubt we'll get into those a bit later
Yes,
on.
of course. I mean, over the next 20 minutes or so, we will be unpacking the merits and demerits, some of the stumbling blocks that this policy could come across. Chris, is this policy plan on a sector level the answer in your books, where we are primarily looking at the automotive and industrial space, and textile spaces, or is this being seen more as the answering of calls from the leftist wing of the ANC?
Well, I think this policy plan is right on the mark in our view. Particularly, its focus on manufacturing. I don't know why they separate textiles from manufacturing, because it's part of the same broader industrial structure. But in my view, the manufacturing sector has been the weakest link in our growth strategy. It sucks in a lot of imports because we don't have manufacturing capacity. So it begins to address that at that level. But as COSATU, we also argue that this manufacturing sector level strategy must be linked directly to other sectors that are of importance, such as agriculture, mining, and logistics.
And that brings us to the whole issue of implementation. Before we get into that discussion, though, Laura, let's bring you into this discussion at this point of the game. Your stance on the policy that's being outlined here. Some saying it's overambitious, it's opportunist, it's anti-capitalistic rather, and unnecessary. Where do you stand?
I think that, when Rob Davies announced his plan to Cabinet, I think something that he mentioned in his speech was that as a country, South Africa actually cannot afford to ignore this policy plan that the government has implemented. I think, we've seen a shift from the 2007-2008 Industrial Policy Action Plan, which was relatively successful, but also included very easy to do actions. And certainly there's been a lot of debate as to whether the targets in terms of job creation, in terms of the key action plans of the individual sectors in the 2010-2011 action plan are obtainable. But I think that overall we have to have a positive view on this policy plan, and I think that various stakeholders from the private sector, public sector, labour, we all have to work together to make this implementation of the 2010-2011 IPAP achievable.
Oh, well, Dennis, certainly, it's undeniable that we are seeing positivity around the overall ambitions and the aims that, this policy sets out to achieve. But there's no denying that it needs to recognise some of the constraints to growth in the economy that, that we face in order to be successful. Now, there are major challenges that could hinder the success of this plan, and first and foremost that springs to mind is power capacity. To what extent are we looking at an investment here being made only to lead to idle capacity possibly sitting down the line?
Yeah, I think that goes to the heart of the problem, which is if you look at some of the failures of the last few years, it really relates to things that the state has been mostly involved in. For example, infrastructure, electricity, skills, education, those sort of areas of the economy. So, in a sense, this is now allowing the state to assume more responsibility, when it seems as though to me that the solution would be to basically resolve some of those issues, to actually help the private sector to actually operate in a way that private sector operates in most economies.
Yep, because Chris, power, of course, is just one of the major input costs for the manufacturers, aggravating the already high cost of doing business in the country. Some saying this is where we need to see more initiative and more effort being directed.
Precisely, and one of the points that is being made in the document is that we need local procurement. So what we'll be watching very closely as COSATU is the degree to which the amount of money that has been allocated to state-owned enterprises, particularly Eskom, because Eskom commands a lion's share of the capital expenditure budget. To what extent is that spent on local procurement? Because in our view, there is local capacity. It's just that we have not been actively supporting it in the past 15 years.
If we look at it, I mean, the policy is expected to create almost, 2.5 million jobs over the next decade. The two industries being focused on being labor intensive. Are you viewing this as a solid basis for job creation in the country?
Without manufacturing, there's nothing that we can do. If you look at historically countries that have industrialized, they've industrialized through state interventions, targeted state intervention. So I think that this lays a framework for us to engage. And what is very important as well is stimulating the manufacturing sector is very important, particularly if you want to support rural development, because without capital equipment, without plastic pipes, without water, energy, your agriculture is going to suffer and food prices are going to rise. So strengthening that part of the economy is very key.
Well, Laura, if we look at it, I mean, how much would it cost to create, if we look at how much it would cost to create those 2.5 million jobs, we had the PAC say 880 billion over the next 10 years. I mean, it boils down to the bottom line. Can the country actually afford it?
There's definitely a concern from both, the public sector and the private sector as to whether government can raise the capital that would be required. When we speak about 880 billion rand, that's just to create the direct jobs that are expected to be created by the 2010-2011 IPAP, not taking into account the indirect jobs. But at the same time, we also need to look at certain sectors that the IPAP looks at targeting that have no infrastructure in place at the moment. That infrastructure is going to have to be developed before the jobs can be created. I know that some of the key action plans look at establishing sort of a local supplier base, and as Chris has mentioned, local procurement. But I think at the moment, South Africa does have the capabilities to meet it. It's just whether they can raise the amount of capital.
Yeah. Well, we'll get into those funding issues and how exactly they could raise that capital moving forward in just a bit. Dennis, just to step back a bit, I mean, I asked whether it's a solid base to start off with at that price, because while the manufacturing and productive sectors of the economy, like Chris highlighted, do form the basis of long-term sustainable growth and job creation in developing countries, we look at the kind of opposite dynamic in the more developed countries where, it's the services space that is at the heart of their economy. So should we possibly moving more in that direction? That is the question out there.
Yeah, look, I actually think that one of the positive things in this development plan is that it does recognize tourism, which the previous one didn't really, so which I think is a key area where government could create jobs very, very quickly and could encourage growth, and of course working on the back of the World Cup, which is coming online in the near future. So it doesn't ignore it entirely. And I guess it is coming from the Department of Trade and Industry, so one would expect that they would actually have a manufacturing sort of bias. But I do think that in our policy deliberations, we tend to underemphasize what services can actually provide.
Yeah, and that's exactly where that linkage comes through also, the filtering through of the benefits that this manufacturing sector would reap off this policy, and like Chris was saying, finding that linkages through other sectors of the economy as well.
If I could just make another point though, on the diversion of finance into deserving industries and increasing local procurement, one must be aware that clearly there are visible advantages to those policies. But what is often unrealized, and which economists tend to lock on, is the opportunity costs of those diversions, and quite often it's not really that visible. So if you and I are paying more for the goods and services that we're actually buying on the street, we're actually spending less on potentially another service provider within the South African economy who could actually be generating jobs as well. And that, I think, there's a clear lacking in this document to look at those effects.